Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Good morning, my name is Emily Walborn, and today's scripture is Luke 24, verses 13 through 32. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who is going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus." He spoke to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Then they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" May the Lord bless this reading and the hearing of his word.
The story starts with loss. Like any good Walt Disney movie, that's the emotional hook that connects us to these two characters walking along a desert road. Loss, I think, is kind of this universal experience, and loss can conjure up all kinds of emotions for us, emotions that we've talked about in this series, anger, anxiety, guilt, regret. But the emotion that we most associate with loss is the emotion of sadness. That heavy feeling that weights us down and saps our energy, that feeling that kind of dulls all the brightness and colors of the world, tinges everything a shade of blue. And one of the themes of this series is the idea that God wired us with all these emotions, that he crafted us to experience every single emotion. So none of them are bad. They're all good. They serve a purpose, even the ones that we would rather not feel, the ones that we avoid. And so even sadness serves a purpose in our lives. And I think it's a dual purpose. It's sadness is the emotion of connecting, and paradoxically, also the emotion of letting go. William Bridges wrote a classic book called Managing Transitions. I've mentioned it before in past sermons. It's one of my favorites. And one of the things I love about William Bridges' work is he separates between change and transition. Change is the external event. It happens outside of us, and it's usually something that happens to us. And often change can happen in a heartbeat, an accident or a breakup or shifting circumstances. In the disciples' case, Change began the moment that the disciples, or that the Roman soldiers burst into the Garden of Gethsemane, led by Judas. And in the space of just 24 hours, the disciples saw their leader crucified and buried. Your world can fall apart just that fast. But different from change, William Bridges says, is the process of transition. Transition is not external, it's internal. He says it's the internal process whereby we accept and accommodate ourselves to the external change around us. And William Bridges, he talks about the fact that this isn't just a solitary process, but it's often something that communities and corporations and businesses do. He cites tons of examples of companies that are experiencing change or maybe even making change themselves, but they are not doing the work of helping people do that internal process of transition. And the thing is without transition, we end up resisting change because the thing we all fear more than anything else is loss. And so Bridges says that there is a process that we go through from the old reality to the new reality, and whereas change can happen in an instant, the process of transition takes time. He calls this time, he calls it the neutral zone is what we all go through. This space between the old and the new. Psychologists call this liminal space, the in-between. And the thing about this in-between space is it is not comfortable space to be in. It's not just that we've experienced a loss, it's rather that we feel lost ourselves. Our identity is confused. Our emotions are all over the place. We don't know which direction is up or down. I've always liked this pictograph of this picture of what the liminal space looks like. It's not a clean line down and up. Instead, it's all over the place in circles like scribbles, right? It's uncomfortable. And so we want to move through that liminal space as fast as we can. Just get it over with. Let's get to the new. But William Bridges cautions us, and he says, no, this neutral zone, this liminal space, that's where the recreation begins. That's where we take all the broken pieces and we begin to put them back together, perhaps in a different way than they were originally. The example he gives is actually a biblical example of the Israelites going from the land of Egypt into the promised land. And he points out God didn't take them by the most direct route possible. Instead, he led them into the wilderness and kind of led them in circles for 40 years, a whole generation. Why? Because they had to let go of Egypt. They had to let go of that slave way of living in order to embrace a new identity, in order to understand themselves rightly as God's children, God's chosen people. Only then would they be ready to enter into the promised land and trust God there. In the same way, the disciples in today's story, they are making a journey. And this journey is far more than just geographical. They're not just traveling the 7 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus. They are traveling the road of grief. Their journey is about letting go. And that's where sadness enters the picture. Sadness is the emotion of letting go. What sadness does is it clears the deck. It creates space in our heart so that we can embrace the possibility of something new. And in that sense, sadness can be a friend who comes and sits beside us and helps us to honor and give thanks for the thing that we love that we've lost so that we can release it and open ourselves to whatever the future may be. So you think about these disciples, and they experienced change in a heartbeat, but now they're trying to go through the process of receiving and opening themselves to the new. And they're struggling with it. The thing about sadness is that it takes time to work, and most of us are not patient with the process of grief and sadness. We just want to hurry it through, like the book that Tracy read in the children's moment. We want to fix sadness. We offer explanations, platitudes. We hurry it along instead of letting sadness do its work. But not Jesus. It would have been so easy for Jesus to take away their sadness, to just say to the disciples, hey, here I am. No need to be sad. No need to feel grief anymore. But he didn't. He allowed himself to remain hidden. Why? Because Jesus knew the work of sadness was not finished. These disciples had not yet let go. They didn't just have to let go of Jesus. They had to be able to let go of their idea of who Jesus was. Because like most Jews in the first century, they thought of the Messiah in terms of political, militaristic terms. They thought the Messiah was going to usher in God's kingdom and push all the Romans out, to set the people free, to establish the throne of David. When they thought about the Messiah, they thought about Palm Sunday, not Good Friday. Triumph, victory, celebration, not loss, grief, death. Even though Jesus had tried to warn them, even though he tried to prepare them, they weren't ready. And even now, walking with Jesus along the road to Emmaus, they had heard the good news. They had heard that the disciples and the women went to the tomb and found it empty, but they didn't believe it. It didn't make sense to them. Their hearts weren't ready to embrace the new. And so what does Jesus do? He walks beside them on the road to Emmaus. And as he walks, the first thing he does is he listens. He says, what are you talking about? And when they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard? He says, what things? He listens to the disciples as if he's never heard the story, as if he didn't live it personally, because he knows they need to express their grief and loss. And after they've finished expressing everything, then he begins to unpack the scriptures for them, taking all those broken pieces of their shattered faith and putting them back together in a way that makes their hearts burn with hope. Finally, they get to the disciples' home, wherever they are traveling to. And Jesus moves to go further on without them. I mean, think about that. That Jesus is not going to force his presence on them. He's not going to short circuit this work of grief at all. He's willing to keep moving on until they're ready. But the disciples, knowing it's late, impress upon him, no, teacher, stay with us. You're welcome in our home. And then Jesus enters into a meal with them. And even though he's the guest in their home, he plays the role of host. And he takes a loaf of bread and he breaks it. And in that moment, their eyes are opened. I just want to linger on that moment just for a second. To reflect on the fact that Jesus is known in the breaking of the bread. And you can understand that literally, right? You know, that the disciples are when Jesus breaks the bread, that they remember how the night before he was betrayed, how he took a loaf of bread and broke it and said, take and eat, each of you, for this is my body broken for you. Like that literal visual memory kind of triggers something for him. But you can also understand it on a deeper level. This idea that Jesus is known in the breaking. That Jesus is present in the sorrow and in the grief. That Jesus allowed himself to be broken for us in order that we might know him in our breaking as well. There's a song I've always loved by Andrew Peterson called The Silence of God. And throughout the song, Peterson reflects on the silence of God and bemoans it, wails against it. He says, God, where are you? Why aren't you responding to me? Why don't you hear me? When I'm pleading for comfort from thy staff and thy rod, and the heaven's only response is the silence of God. Where are you? But about halfway through the song, he begins to reflect on a statue of Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane, silent as a stone. And all his friends are sleeping and he's weeping all alone. And then Peterson writes this, he says, and the man of all sorrows, he never forgot. What sorrow is carried by the hearts that he bought. And when the questions dissolve into the silence of God, the aching may remain, but the breaking does not. I don't know where you might be this morning, but I just want to say to you, if you are in a place of breaking this morning, if you're in that liminal space, that in-between space where everything feels confused and upside down, where the hurt of letting go overshadows the hope of whatever might be, if you're in that space, I want you to know that God is there with you in it. Jesus walks with us along the road to Emmaus. And he may be silent, but it's not a silence of absence. It's a silence of presence, a silence of listening and holding us in our grief and our hurt. Jesus is present in the breaking. He allowed himself to be broken so that he might know us by compassion and so that we might know him by grace. He was broken so he could enter into our brokenness so that we might enter into his hope and be healed. And I do believe that on the other side of the breaking, there is a healing, that there is new life. And thankfully in that space, though the aching may remain, the breaking does not. And on the other side of that, the breaking is replaced by grace and peace, forgiveness and gratitude. And just like that, as soon as the disciples see Jesus, he's gone. Leaving the disciples to wonder in amazement. I've always wondered about that. Like, why doesn't Jesus stay with them a little bit longer? Why doesn't he celebrate with them? Why doesn't he drink in their praise and adoration? Why doesn't he at least finish the meal? And the only answer I have is this, that perhaps it wasn't necessary because they'd seen Jesus. They'd seen him in the breaking. They knew that he was with them, and they could now follow Jesus without his physical presence. They knew they weren't alone. Grief had done its work, and by the grace of God, they were ready for the next chapter in the story. Amen. Well, as we've done throughout this series, we take a few minutes for conversation together, and this is our last week in the series on seeking wellness. And in some ways, it's a strange week, a way to end talking about grief, but in some ways, it's appropriate, you know?
Yeah, very appropriate, because all the emotions that we've talked about in this series are present during grief.
Right, yeah, they're all kind of part of, and every single one of us will experience grief. Like, you know, there's no way to protect ourselves from experiencing loss. It's going to happen, right?
Right. It could be the loss of a loved one or a loved pet, but it also could be a transition from a job loss or some change that you even have initiated on your own.
Yeah, like even a good change you choose can still produce grief.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I left my corporate career to pursue ministry, I wanted to do that. And about 2 or 3 months in, I thought, I feel pretty sad. I don't know what's wrong with me. Like, I was losing stuff. Like, where's my purse? Where are my keys? And I walked out of school one day, and I didn't know where my car was. And I thought, oh, I know what's happening. This is grief. I missed my people. I missed my old identity. So, that's how it manifested for me.
So it wasn't just the loss of keys or a car. It was like that loss was connected to a whole lot of other loss that you experienced. And we often talk about grief as if it's this clear-cut process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief, as if it's clean and linear. But it's the stages of grief aren't always like that.
Usually not, right? It's not linear at all, and we even repeat stages because when we're grieving, all the pieces of our brain that control our emotions, that help us regulate our emotions, our memory, our learning, are all impacted by our grieving.
Yeah, and that really stinks when you repeat a phase.
Yeah.
Like, you
thought it was over.
I thought I was over this, and then suddenly I'm right back in anger or right back in denial or shock. It's like, when am I ever going to get my way out of here?
Exactly. Because, people talk about closure, and I don't think that that's a thing, and that's not really what we're going for,
Right.
with grief. You are going to experience all the phases, but...
What I like about that graphic we had was the final stage isn't closure. The final stage is leading a meaningful, return to a meaningful life. And say a little bit about that word meaning.
Yeah, so David Kessler, who actually was a protege to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, had a great loss himself. He lost his son at a young age, and so he started thinking about, what else is there? And he decided that there's a stage of grieving that is called meaning making, where we sort of integrate the loss into who we are now, and we use that loss hopefully to help other people, experience and process their own losses. So that gives meaning to the loss we've experienced when we can help someone else through a loss.
Right, and everyone makes their own meaning. It's very personal.
Yeah.
And it takes time. That's been kind of a theme this morning with me, is taking time. Because any meaning that you make in a snap is probably shallow, maybe even false meaning. It's we need to give ourselves time to do that.
And permission for it to be messy and slow and uncertain.
Right. Yeah, but our culture doesn't do that, right?
No, not at all.
We take your 3 days.
3 days. 3 days and back. Take your 3 days, do all the things you need to do.
Or people call for a week, and then after that they don't.
Yeah.
And if you still say, for a week, people give you permission to say you're sad.
Right.
But then after that, there's kind of
come on. This is making me uncomfortable.
yeah, it's making me uncomfortable. Yeah, so we tend to push people through this pretty fast. And so one of the things, you have to give yourself space, time to work through this.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask the question, because I think it's a good question for us to consider, is yes, we're all going to experience sadness, which is part of the cycle of grief, but how do we know if it's going too long? Is there, what's the difference between grief and depression, which is kind of a chronic sadness?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, sadness will last for a while. We've all been sad, maybe it lasts for a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days, maybe a week. But if your sadness includes feelings of worthlessness, if you have no energy, no motivation, you can't get out of bed, you're overeating, you're undereating, and it lasts for longer than 2 weeks, then that could be clinical depression, and you really need to seek some outside support.
Yeah, and so I think that's one of the things we want to kind of emphasize throughout the series is if you're struggling with anything, whether it's anger, anxiety, shame, sadness, you're not meant to go through those things alone. Seek out help, or even just open yourselves up to friends who are around you, because we're not meant to walk the road of grief by ourselves.
Yeah, Jesus walking with the disciples is just a perfect example of how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to find our people and be with them in their sadness.
Yeah, and you had a great quote from Brene Brown.
Oh yeah. I really like when she says, we've got to find a companion to walk with, but that person has to be appropriate. And so Brene Brown says that everyone doesn't deserve to hear your story. So if the person can't empathize, then they probably don't deserve to hear your story. They're probably not the best companion to process your grief with.
Yeah, and not everyone who says, "How are you?" can you dump emotionally. You have to find people you trust. But there's actually a video we wanted to show that has Brene Brown's words set to some animation, but it's a really good picture of what it looks like to walk with someone. Can we show that?
Yeah.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too.
I like the silver lining. Ooh, want a sandwich? But that's our uncomfort, our discomfort with being sad. But that's where I said sadness isn't just about letting go, but it's also about connection, because it creates that capacity for empathy, versus just a sympathy that's throwing thoughts and prayers at someone,
Yeah, well, I'm saying, hurry up. I'm uncomfortable. Yeah, empathy requires us to, like she said, feel our own feelings in the midst of someone else's sadness.
And when the guy climbed down, he says, I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. And I think that sometimes is part of that meaning making of the grief cycle, is when we're able to take our own experience and kind of turn it around and be able to say, I know what that's like. I've seen that happen lots of times, where people who have suffered a loss, a tragedy of some kind, or gone through cancer, or whatever it might be, how and sometimes years later, they are the best people who can minister and walk with someone else because they've been there and they've done that. And that becomes part of their healing too.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times when we have a tragedy that causes us to grieve, we feel like no one understands, no one gets it, we're alone, they don't want to hear what I have to say. So when someone has had a very similar experience, I think a lot of times they can use that experience to help someone who's in the midst of theirs.
Yeah. So this is our last week in the whole series. So
yeah.
So do you have any parting words, to wrap up, put a bow?
Yeah,
closure, which you're not supposed to see, closure, to give meaning to this series?
Integration. Yeah, so first of all, David, I want to say thank you. Thank you for making space for this conversation, because I think it's vitally important. And I think that it takes a lot of courage. And I think that some people would just rather not, so they don't, right? But you were brave enough to have this public conversation with the congregation. And I'm positive that it's been super helpful for people. So I want to thank you for doing it. And I also want to hope that your sermons and our conversations have opened up space and given people permission to talk about their struggles, to seek help when they're struggling, and to know that that's okay, that church is a place where we can seek all kinds of wellness.